My name is Divya. I'm a library science student at the University of Arizona. And to be honest, I never really thought I would be the one to put Excel tutorials onto YouTube. However, recently I was working with Excel and I found that I was needing to figure out some things for which I could not find tutorials online. And so I wanted to put some of my solutions on here with the hope that they helped someone else. And what I'm going to be talking about today is how to take the filter function that has rigid ranges in its array and also in its include criteria and make those dynamic. The use case that I had for this was I was trying to clean some data that was coming out of REDCap. And REDCap and SPSS, a lot of data collection software, Qualtrics also. I work in research. These tools allow you to export your data in a CSV format. And a lot of times, once you do that, you need to clean it, you need to present it in a particular way. And what I was finding was that there was a need there for the filter to be a bit more flexible than it is when it stands alone. The data that I have here are the completion times of the Tour de France race. This is an open source data set. I just was looking up open source data sets that I could use online for the purposes of example. I found this one. And it resembles something that would be a CSV export of data coming out of a database. And so in my first tab, that's where I would paste my raw data. And in this second tab here that I'm going to call the typical filter, I'm going to go through really quick what I would do with a filter function if I was just going to use it alone, And then in the second tab here, I'm going to create a reference sheet so that I can make a dynamic filter. And in the subsequent tab, this is going to be my new dynamic filter. I think I spelled appropriately, but I have a screen. There we go. I had a message that said, would you like to stop sharing your screen? And I wasn't able to quite see what I typed. So going back to the raw data and the typical filter, if I were to filter these data using a typical filter, what I would do is equals filter. I would select my array. Let's say I was going, this isn't actually the top of the data set, so let me scroll back up to that. And I'm not going to select the whole thing, I'm just going to select a chunk because this is a very long data set. Equals filter. I'm going to start at the top and I'm going to go down to like 200, nice and round. And then I'd like to include values 2 to 200. Let me change that manually just so I A2 to A200. Notice that these have to be the same. This goes from 2 to 200, my whole array, so my include criteria has to go from 2 to 200 as well. And I want to include values that equal 1903, let's say. And I don't have to hard code this here. I can tie it to a cell reference and say equals cell, like H10 or something. And then I can put 1903 in there or 1904 in there. For the purposes of this, I'm just going to hard code it. And then I'll get a filter that only has 1903. But the problem with the typical filter is that if you look, it says A2 to 200. But what if I delete rows? Then maybe my bottommost row isn't 200 anymore. What if I gave you the example of this is imported data coming in and then my filters cleaning that data are in the next tab? What if my import has more rows than 200? Or it has less rows, or it's different because it's a different import. It might have the same variable names, but a different number of records. In that case, do I have to change the filter manually each time and say, well, this time I want it to go from 200 to 300 because that's the bottom of my data set? I could do this. This would work. This is also very error prone. And so the purpose of this video is to go through how do you build the filter function such that these bounds aren't hard-coded. The addresses of the cells that are in the array. And the way to do that is the address function, along with the concat function that strings text together. And I'm going to go through how to do that in the reference sheet to make it so that no matter how many rows of data you add here or delete, the bounds of your filter will respond to that change in your raw data. There is a way to do this if you have raw data that you've applied a filter to, and then you are filtering the filter. But this particular video is talking about making a dynamic filter when you don't have a filter of an array that already exists. This is when you are trying to filter just the raw data and you're determining this highlight of the array. Make sure that it goes down as far as it needs to go, depending on the data that's here. And don't set it so that it is so rigid and tells you how far it's going to go down. So to do this, in the reference sheet, you're going to need the top of your filter array. You're going to need the bottom of your filter array. And you're going to need the sheet name. Then you're going to need the top of your include array. That's the thing you want to filter by, so by year as we did, the 1903, 1904. And then you need the bottom of your include array to build this. And then you're going to need the sheet name for that. To find the top of your include array, in this case, when you're looking at an imported data set, TDF finishers, typically the top row is always your variable column, and you don't have anything above it. So it's fair to say it's usually A1. If there is something above it, then it would be that in your case, whatever that top leftmost cell is. And here you use the address function. What the address function asks of you is the row number and the column number. In this case, it's easy. Row 1, column 1, A1. And then the bottom of your filter array would be, if you think about it, and a caveat here is this solution will not work if you have every column in your data set having blanks like this. Notice that everything doesn't have a team name. Only some people have team names, because this won't work if there are blanks, if all of your columns have blanks, because the way it's determining the bottommost part of your data set, that false bottom that keeps increasing when you add data or decreasing based on what you paste in your initial raw data, is based on blank values. So the first thing you do is you count the rows that are full, and then you subtract out the blank rows. So all these rows, and then you subtract out the blanks, which means that you get to whatever the bottommost part of your table is, even though this isn't formally a table, the bottommost part of your data set. So if you have fewer rows, then there are more blanks, and your bottom of your array will adjust accordingly. However, that will only work if everything is filled up to this point. When you're working in research, things are often assigned a subject ID, so you can count on that column having every field filled, and you can use that to gauge your row number. But if this is something that won't work if you have a blank here, a blank there, a blank here, a blank there, because that will change your count blank value because the blanks will be in the middle of your data set instead of the end. But if they're only really at the end, to find the bottom, what you do is you count out the total number of rows in this array at a giant number. But then you can subtract out the blanks. Same range. And now you get, oh, I have this many full cells. So that means row 9,883 is my bottommost. Notice that this changes if I have an export that maybe doesn't have that many. And cuts off there. Now my reference number has become 9,880. So then I use the address function as I did before, but it asks for two things: row number. The row number is now actually the outcome of this subtraction. So then I move on, and the column number I want in this case is 5, because when I think of how I set up that initial array for the filter function, it goes from the top left to the bottom right. And the bottom right now is column 5. I'm only hard coding the columns here because there's already so much going on in this video. But typically, I would not ever hard code columns because you don't know if you're going to add columns to your raw data, or someone else looking at your spreadsheet might not realize that you have formulas going on in an adjacent tab, and they might add a helper column to help them see things. Or maybe I want to add more information to my import, and instead of putting it here at the end, I decide I want to know color of jersey. If I do this, now the end of my array has become column F. But because I hard-coded the column, the bottom of my filter array, the bottom rightmost, still says it's column E, which is wrong because I added this column. In this case, that was supposed to be a delete. Delete. In this case, what you would do, what is better practice, is to use the index function and the match function together. The match function gives you a number outcome, and the index function helps you find a particular cell. And so what you would do is you'd use the index and match function. Instead of saying, hey, find me column 5, because column 5 can change if you add color of jersey, you would say, find me the column number. That's what index and match together do. Find me the column number that is titled team. So if that happens to be column 5, it will spit out column 5. If you've added color of jersey, if you've added nationality, whatever else you might add, and team becomes the 6th or the 7th column, if you use index or match, it will dynamically change that. Where here you've just put find me column 5, here you'd put like index, and then the index function will ask you for its arguments, and you'd use index and match together. Because there's so much going on in this video, I'm not doing that, but if this was for a real project, I would do that because I hesitate around hard-coded column numbers. But you have your bottom of your filter array, and you have your sheet name, TDF finishers. This is, when I make these kinds of spreadsheets, set up a cell where the sheet name is written in, because when you're sharing it with people, you need the sheet name ultimately in your cell reference when you're building out this cell reference. You don't have to write it somewhere, as I am here, and then reference the cell that has its title. The benefit for me in doing this is if there's any kind of error, I find that if other people are using a spreadsheet that I put together, it allows a kind of agency for them to be able to go in and check, oh, I see an error. Is it because the sheet name is wrong? Is it mistyped here? Or did I change it down here and then forget to change it in my reference sheet? This allows people who aren't as familiar with Excel formulas to make the changes themselves. It is not necessary, though, to have a separate sheet name set up like this and then reference the cell, when we put everything together, why do we need to put stuff together? Because in the end, what you are trying to get at, once you've identified your top of your filter array, bottom of your filter array, and then the top of the include array is the same thing, because the include column is this A column. So the top of that would also be A1, and the bottom of that would be the bottom of the rows. Here. So the top would be 1 again. And then the bottom would be the row number is, again, your rows of this whole array minus the blank ones of this whole array. So then that'll give you the dynamic false bottom of your row number and your column number, because this is your include. If you're including by the year is 1. If you're including by the writer, if you're including by time, then you would use column 2 or whatever else. But I'm just going to use 1. And so I have my bottom of the include array. And again, the sheet name, PDF. But if you go into the typical filter, you look and you see that all your references are together. Like this is your full array, this is your include array, and what you need to do is you need to get everything into this format where there's the addresses of the 2 cells with a colon, and the same formatting here for the sheet name of the 2 apostrophes around the sheet name. You only have apostrophes around sheet names when sheet names have spaces in them, but it's kind of like looking for the, the greatest common factor in math. The greatest common factor between, I might be confusing least common multiple and greatest common factor. When you have 12 and 24, the commonality between them, I need to reference math textbooks again. But basically, the more forgiving thing to do is to say that if your sheet has spaces, your sheet name is going to need apostrophes. If your sheet name doesn't have spaces, your sheet name doesn't need apostrophes. However, if it has apostrophes, it'll still work. But using the apostrophes in the sheet name, no matter what, when you build the formula, make sure that no matter what your sheet name is, it'll still read. So you ultimately need to have that set up. And to do that, to get the full sheet name here for the array, or not the full sheet name, the full reference, and the full reference for the include goes in this cell, in the green one, and then the array will go in the blue one. You would use the concat function. You would concat, and you can put the whole sheet name here. I could do TDF finishers with the exclamation point that's part of the sheet name, and then go A1 reference, colon, bottom reference, bottom reference, and then be done with it. However, the downside with doing this is, again, if there's a change in the sheet name or something like that, then it needs to be changed in the formula. However, that can confuse people who aren't familiar with using formulas. So I find it easier to build the syntax in, the apostrophe in double quotes, and then reference the sheet name cell. You can fix all of these if you want. And pressing F4. And then go back, put the apostrophe, the exclamation point. If you didn't miss a parentheses, then, oh, I missed an apostrophe. There we go. There, apostrophe, exclamation point. So now I have the apostrophe, reference to the sheet name that goes to the cell where I type the sheet name, and then the closing apostrophe, exclamation point to get to the formatting of how a sheet name should be written, and then the top and the bottom of the array. And doing this gets you the same outcome that we did before, hard coding the TDL finishers into the sheet name. However, if someone needs to edit, all they have to do is edit this. See, it's actually TDF finishers. I made a mistake. So now if I change this to TDL finishers, and then I change this to TDL finishers, because that's what I've been saying the whole time, even though it's Tour de France, then when I change this sheet name, and then I change the sheet name here, it changed in the formula. So that's the benefit of having the sheet name be a reference somewhere. And you don't need it twice. I just did it twice for it to make sense to separate the include and the array. I can reference this same sheet name in this array. I turned that around, didn't I? I can reference the same sheet name in the include as I did for the array. So now, long videos must not be my strong suit. I'm sorry. So now we have the array for the full filter. We have the full array, that the first argument that the filter asks for. We have it here with the sheet name and the reference, so we're good. Now we need to do the same thing for the include. We have the top, we have the bottom of the include, and we have the sheet name. And so it's basically the same concat function, except your top and your bottom are different. It's B5 and B6. TDL finishers, referencing the top, referencing the bottom, and you have what you would put for the include. So now when you make your new dynamic filter, the only thing you need to remember is that, and I also actually, when I set it up like this with a reference sheet, I find the filter function just cleaner to use. It drives me less crazy because there's fewer things in it, and so it doesn't seem like a bunch of commas with content. What you have here for the array of the filter function and the include, these are text values. We're treating them like cell references because that's what we want them to be. But ultimately, when we go and we put them into the filter function, we need to remember to couch them in one of these guys, into an indirect function, because an indirect function turns a text reference into a cell reference. And I've actually seen the indirect function used on YouTube to call sheet references, where they take the concat function and they put the apostrophe, sheet name, apostrophe, exclamation point in text, like using the concat function or the ampersand, and then apply an indirect function to that to call a sheet name. However, I've not seen the indirect function used as I am using it now. Let me know if I'm wrong, please, to make a filters criteria dynamic. So in the new dynamic filter, you have equals filter. What's the array? We already have that set up right here. We have this cell. And again, you can fix it by pressing F4. You kind of want to do that for as many of these as you can, because everything on the reference sheet, you don't want to move because it's referencing specific cells. And if you drag the function for any reason, it might move, and you don't want that. So you can put dollar signs next to the rows and the columns for the cell address to make it fixed. But indirect, the reference for your full array. Now, what do you want to include? You actually have that too, right here. So indirect reference for, I'm going to fix it again, pressing F4, the reference for your include column. And so now you have the array part of that, but you have to set it equal to something. Set it equal to a year. We can, again, hard code this. Or we can set it to a cell. This time I'm going to set it to a cell so we can see what we're doing. And we can change it and see how that changes. And then fix that cell by pressing F4, if it lets me. And then what we have is filter. So this indirect reference before is our array, comma, what do you want to include? Indirect, our reference B7 is our include array that we built. And it equals the value that we set in G7, which right when I do this is going to come up with an error because we don't have a value in G7, a calculation error. But if we go back to G7 for a moment, and I'm just going to change the color so that we know that that's the cell we're putting stuff in, and we set that to 1903. Then we get all the values in 1903. And actually, it may even make more sense to insert and then make this that row, because then we can see it in our dynamic filter. So I will not make it G7. That's the value that we are calling to in the dynamic filter. Instead, say it equals whatever is up here in A11. And fix that because we don't want that to move by pressing F4. So now when A11 says it's 1903, we get all our values for 1903. What about 2023? There's nothing there, so we get a calculation error. And 2022, we have values. The benefit of this is if I go here and I go down to the bottom of my data set and I add new stuff, 2023, that had a calculation error before. Let's say there's a rank 12. There's a Menezes Alta, whose time is 10 hours, 20 minutes, 20 minutes, and then 1 second. And they are in the team Ejemplo. And there's also somebody else in 2023 that I need to add to my raw data, and they are not doing so great. They're ranked 9,101. They're probably Dolores Triste. They're very sad that they're not doing so well. And their time was probably 22 hours, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 seconds, and they were ejemplo 2. Ejemplo means example in Spanish. And now I've added data to my raw data, and my filter goes down more than it used to. My typical filter can't manage that because it sets the bounds. But you look, my reference sheet, my reference filters moved. The values here were not 9,882 before, but they moved to accommodate my new additions, which means that the dynamic filter that is built from this reference sheet that moved, now when I put in my new values from 2023, they show up what I just added. So the benefit of this filter is that it can grow and change with your incoming data. And it's something that I have found very, very helpful. As I said, when I started, I am not versed in making tutorial videos on Excel, so I hope this makes sense. But if there's anything that's confusing, or as you're working through this, you stumble into an error, please do comment and leave your feedback, and I'm happy to help and troubleshoot with you. We're all learning together, and thanks for visiting.